Welcome, survivors, to the edge of the apocalypse, where every story is a fight to stay alive. Thanks from the bottom of my heart for every like, comment, and sub. Keep hitting that bell and join the fight with me. Thanks from the bottom of my heart.
The red emergency light is rotating, a rhythmic, bloody strobe that turns the control room into a pulsing wound. I can hear them. 60 feet of reinforced concrete and lead-lined steel should be enough to keep the world out, but the scratching isn't coming from the surface. It's coming from the ventilation shafts. My name is Mike, and I am, or was, a nuclear missile silo operator for the United States Air Force. Right now, my hand is shaking so hard I can barely hold my service pistol. The air in here is thick with the smell of ozone, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of blood that's cooling on the floor next to the main console. My partner, Elias, is dead, or he should be. I put 3 rounds into his chest when he tried to bite through my throat, but he's still moving, his fingers twitching against the linoleum, his fingernails snapping as he claws at the floor. He isn't screaming. They don't scream. They just make this wet, gurgling sound like a man trying to breathe through a mouthful of seawater. It all started 3 hours ago. We were halfway through a standard 24-hour shift when the SATCOM went dead. No warning. No static, just a sudden suffocating silence. Then the emergency alert system triggered, but there were no codes, no launch orders, just a looped recording of a woman screaming in a language I didn't recognize, followed by the sound of something tearing. We checked the perimeter cameras, expecting to see Russian paratroopers or a Chinese strike team. What we saw was worse. The surface gate was swarmed. Not by soldiers, but by people, hundreds of them. They weren't trying to get in to hide, they were trying to get in to eat. I watched on a grainy black and white monitor as a group of them pulled a security guard out of his reinforced glass booth. They didn't use weapons, they used their teeth. They tore him apart like a pack of starving wolves, but they didn't stop when he died. They kept going until there was nothing left but red smears on the concrete. And then the guard stood back up. His arm was missing from the elbow down, and his entrails were dragging behind him like a gray ribbon, but he stood up and started pounding on the inner blast door. That was when I knew the world was over. The uncanny valley effect is real, but it's not just about robots. It's about seeing your commanding officer, a man who gave you a commendation last month, looking at you through a camera lens with eyes that are milky white and devoid of anything resembling a soul. He looked like a puppet with its strings cut, his head lolling at an impossible angle, his mouth opening and closing in a mindless reflex. The isolation of the silo, which usually feels like a fortress, suddenly felt like a coffin. We are buried alive with the keys to the end of the world. I looked at the launch console. The 2 keys were already in their slots, ready for the turn. We had been trained for the apocalypse, for the thermal flash and the radioactive fallout. We hadn't been trained for this. The ventilation system hummed, a low-frequency vibration that usually lulled me to sleep, but now it sounded like a funeral dirge. Then the scratching started. It began in the upper levels, a frantic, skittering sound like rats in the walls, but heavier, much heavier. Elias thought someone was trying to reach us, a survivor maybe. He opened the secondary hatch against my orders. He wanted to be a hero. He wanted to believe there was still a world worth saving. When the thing that used to be a maintenance tech dropped from the ladder, it didn't look human. It was bloated, its skin translucent and stretched tight over muscles that seemed to be vibrating with a frenetic, unnatural energy. It didn't pause. It didn't hesitate. It lunged with a speed that defied physics. I can still hear the sound of Elias' neck snapping. It was a sharp, dry pop like a twig breaking in winter. I fired until my magazine was empty. The things in the vents are responding to the noise. They are smarter than the ones on the surface. They are coordinated. I can hear them tapping on the pipes, 3 taps, then a pause, then 3 more. They are testing the seals. They are finding the weak points in our sanctuary. My oxygen is at 40%. The scrubbers are failing because the intake on the surface is clogged with, God, I don't even want to think about what is clogging them. Bits of hair, scraps of clothing, flesh. I am sitting in a chair worth $1 million, surrounded by technology that can incinerate a continent, and I am going to die because I can't breathe. I looked at the monitor one last time. The screen flickered, showing a view of the nearby town. The horizon was on fire. Not the clean, white light of a nuclear blast, but the messy, orange glow of a civilization burning itself down. I realized then that I wasn't an operator anymore. I was a gravedigger. If I turn the keys, I can end it. I can turn this entire sector into a crater of glass and ash. I can give those things out there the only mercy they deserve. But the codes are gone. The link to the National Command Authority is severed. I am holding the trigger to a gun that has no hammer. I am just a man in a box waiting for the lid to open. The scratching is closer now. It's right above my head. A drop of thick black bile falls from the ceiling vent and lands on the launch button. I look up. A pale, fingerless hand is reaching through the slats of the vent. The nails are gone, replaced by jagged bone shards. It's not Miller. It's not Elias. It's something new. Something that evolved in the 3 hours since the world died. It's beautiful in its horror, a perfect predator for a dying species. I reach for my last magazine. My hands are finally still. The adrenaline has passed, replaced by a cold, hollow certainty. I am the last man in the silo. I might be the last man on Earth. And as the vent cover buckles and the screeching of metal on metal fills the room, I realize I don't need the launch codes. I just need to hold the line for as long as I can. Because if they get down here, if they get to the missiles, they won't just eat us, they'll use us to spread. The door to the lower level moans as something slams against it. The steel is 4 inches thick, but it's bowing inward. I stand up, leveling my pistol at the door. My heart is a steady drumbeat now. Thump, 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 the same rhythm as the scratching. I am part of the machine now. I am the last failsafe, and the failsafe is about to break. The first crack appears in the concrete wall. Not from a blast, but from the sheer pressure of the bodies on the other side. They are piling up, a mountain of meat and hunger pushing against the world until it breaks. I can see the first eye through the crack. It's not white anymore. It's red, reflecting the emergency light, reflecting the end. I pull the trigger. The recoil kicks against the palm of my hand, a sharp metallic snap that rings through the narrow corridor, amplified tenfold by the weeping concrete walls. The eye behind the crack disappears in a spray of gray matter and blackened blood, but the pressure doesn't stop. It intensifies. The concrete doesn't just crack, it groans, a deep, tectonic sound that vibrates through the soles of my boots. I'm not fighting people anymore. I'm fighting a geological event made of flesh. The first round was a gesture, a reflex of a dying world, and as I rack the slide to chamber the next, I realize how utterly insignificant a 9mm slug is against a mountain of the damned. The steel door, a 4-inch slab of reinforced pride, shudders again. The hinges, bolted deep into the bedrock, are beginning to weep orange flakes of rust as they are pulled from their sockets. I fire again, and then again, rhythmic and cold, aiming for the gaps where the light of the red emergency strobes glints off wet, seeking shapes. Each shot is a beat in a song of extinction. The smell hits me then, not just the rot, but the hot, cloying scent of a slaughterhouse floor in mid-August. It's the smell of thousands of bodies packed into a space meant for air and shadow, their collective body heat baking the decay until the air itself feels heavy and humid, like a tropical storm made of death. I back away, my boots crunching on the spent brass. The floor is slick with something, hydraulic fluid from the bucking door or the black ichor of the things outside. I can't tell. I reach the secondary bulkhead, the one that leads into the umbilical tunnel connecting the command center to the missile tube itself. This is the inner sanctum. This is where the world was supposed to end at the push of a button, not by the gnashing of teeth. I slam the manual override, and the secondary door begins its slow, agonizing crawl shut. It's a horizontal slide, a massive slab of steel that hissed with pneumatic grace 6 months ago, but now it screams, protesting the lack of maintenance. The lack of grease, the lack of a world that cared if it functioned. Through the narrowing gap, I see the primary door finally give way. It doesn't burst, it collapses. The pressure of the bodies behind it is so immense that the first row of infected aren't even walking. They are being extruded through the opening like meat through a grinder. Their bones snap under the weight of those behind them, their ribcage popping like dry kindling, but they don't stop. They can't stop. The mass of them spills into the room, a chaotic, thrashing carpet of limbs and shattered faces. The red light catches a reaching hand, the fingers worn down to the bone from scratching at the concrete, and then the secondary door slams shut with a finality that echoes in my marrow. I am alone in the dark. The silence of the umbilical is absolute for a heartbeat, and then the scratching begins on this side. It's softer here, muffled by the thickness of the steel, but I know they are there. They are filling the command center, the room where I used to drink lukewarm coffee and read paperbacks while waiting for a war that never came. Now, the war is here, and it's hungry. I turn and run down the long, metal-grated walkway. My flashlight beam dances wildly over the pipes and conduits that line the walls. The air here is colder, smelling of ozone and old grease. I can feel the weight of the earth above me, hundreds of feet of dirt and rock, and the ruins of a civilization that didn't know how to die quietly. I reach the end of the walkway and look down into the silo itself. The Minuteman III sits there, a pale, indifferent god in its cathedral of steel. It's beautiful in a terrifying way, a pencil-thin monument to the end of days. I scramble down the ladder, my hands slipping on the cold rungs. My breath comes in ragged gasps, the only sound in the cavernous space except for the distant, rhythmic thumping of the horde against the bulkhead. They know I'm here. They can smell the heat of my blood, the salt of my sweat. They are a hive mind of hunger, and I am the last grain of sugar in the bowl. I reach the maintenance level, halfway down the length of the missile. My supplies are cached here. 3 crates of MREs, a dozen gallons of water, and a crate of ammunition I scavenged from the security locker when the world went dark. It's not enough. It was never going to be enough. I sit on the edge of the metal grating, my legs dangling over the abyss of the launch tube, and I check my pistol. 4 rounds left in the mag. 2 spare magazines on my belt. 34 chances to say no to the dark. I pull a canteen from my pack and take a sip. The water tastes of plastic and stale air, but it's the most precious thing I own. As I drink, I listen. The scratching has changed. It's no longer just at the door. It's coming from the vents. The ventilation system for a silo is a complex network of hardened pipes and filters, designed to keep out radioactive fallout, but it wasn't designed to keep out something that doesn't need to breathe. Something that can dislocate its shoulders to squeeze through a 10-inch duct. I stand up, the exhaustion pulling at my muscles like lead weights. I haven't slept in 36 hours, and the adrenaline is starting to curdle in my veins, leaving me twitchy and hollow. I move toward the control terminal on this level, a secondary diagnostic station. The screen is flickering, a ghost of the old world trying to stay awake. I pull up the internal sensors. Most of the cameras are dead, static-filled rectangles of nothingness, but camera 4, the one in the main elevator shaft, is still working. I wish it wasn't. The shaft is filled with them. They are climbing. They aren't using the ladders. They are jamming their fingers into the gaps in the corrugated metal, hauling themselves up with a terrifying, mindless strength. They look like insects, a swarm of pale, mottled beetles climbing toward the light. I realize then that the silo isn't a fortress. It's a trap. It's a vertical tomb, and I've crawled all the way to the bottom. The psychological toll is a physical weight. I think about the man I was before the sirens. I had a dog, a golden retriever, who used to sleep at the foot of my bed and dream of chasing squirrels. I had a wife who laughed at my bad jokes and made the best lasagna in the tri-state area. Now, they are either part of the mountain of meat or they are dust. I try to hold on to their faces, but the red light of the silo bleeds into my memories, staining them. All I can see is the red eye through the crack. All I can hear is the screeching of metal. I'm no longer a man. I'm a component of the silo. I am the last failsafe, a biological circuit breaker meant to ensure that the fire stays in the hole. But what if the fire is the only thing that can clean this mess? The thought creeps in like a shadow. The launch codes are gone, scrambled by the collapse of the command chain, but there are other ways to trigger a payload. There are maintenance overrides, physical bypasses that were never meant to be used by one person. It would be easy. A few turns of a wrench, a shorting of the firing circuit, and I could turn this silo into a sun. I could incinerate the horde, the silo, and myself in a fraction of a second. It would be a clean death, a hot, bright, absolute end. But then I remember the fear I had at the beginning. If they get to the missiles, they won't just eat us, they'll use us to spread. I look at the missile, the white skin of the airframe reflecting the emergency lights. It's not just a weapon, it's a delivery system. If the virus gets into the propellant, if it survives the heat, and from what I've seen, this thing is more resilient than any biological agent we've ever studied. A launch could seed the atmosphere. It wouldn't be a nuclear winter, it would be a plague rain. The horror of it roots me to the spot. I have to make sure this silo stays buried. I have to make sure it never opens. A sound from above snaps me back. A heavy asterisk thud followed by the screech of a vent cover being ripped away. They're in. I don't go for the gun this time. I grab the heavy pipe wrench from the tool rack. It's 3 feet of solid steel, a primitive weapon for a primitive time. I move toward the ladder, but I don't go up. I go down. There is a crawl space at the very bottom of the tube, the flame trench where the exhaust is diverted during a launch. It leads to the drainage sumps and the deep earth cooling pipes. It's narrow, wet, and dark, but it's the only place they can't swarm me. One by one, I can take them. In the dark, in the tight spaces where numbers don't matter, I can be the monster. I reach the bottom of the tube, the floor a sea of old water and oily residue. The smell here is overwhelming, the damp of the earth mixing with the chemical tang of the missile's fuel systems. I find the hatch to the flame trench and heave it open. It groans, a sound that echoes up the entire height of the silo. Above me, I hear the first of them hit the metal grating of the maintenance level. They don't scream. They make a sound like a wet cough, a rhythmic wheeze of dead lungs trying to move air. I drop into the trench and pull the hatch shut above me, bolting it from the inside. The space is barely 4 feet high. I have to crouch, my knees screaming in protest. I turn on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick, stagnant air. The walls are soot-stained concrete, the floor a graveyard of rusted bolts and discarded scraps of insulation. I move slowly, the pipe wrench held tight in my hand. My heartbeat is the only clock I have left. Thump, thump, thump. It feels slower now, a heavy, deliberate pulse. I am becoming part of the bedrock. I find a spot where the trench narrows, a choke point where the cooling pipes crowd the space. I sit down, my back against the cold wall. I turn off the flashlight to save the batteries. The darkness is total. It's a sensory deprivation chamber that forces me back into my own head. I think about the rations. At 2 meals a day, I have 6 days. At 1 meal, 12. Water will last longer if I don't move, but the dampness here will eventually breed mold, or I'll catch something from the standing water. My mind starts to wander, constructing scenarios of rescue that I know are fantasies. The world above is a graveyard. There is no cavalry coming to save a lone operator in a hole in the ground. There is only the silence and the scratching. And then I hear it, not from above. From ahead of me deeper in the trench, a soft, wet sound, a sliding noise like something heavy being dragged over wet concrete. SSSSHHH blip. SSSSHHH blip. My heart rate spikes, the steady drumbeat shattering into a frantic staccato. I fumble for the flashlight, my fingers trembling. I click it on. The beam cuts through the dark, and for a second I see nothing but the gray walls. Then the light hits it. It's not one of the ones from the command center. This one is different. It's pale, almost translucent, its skin slick with the moisture of the trench. It's thin, its limbs elongated, its fingers tipped with jagged, blackened claws. It has no eyes, just smooth, weeping skin where the sockets should be. It's been down here for a long time. Maybe it was a maintenance worker caught in the pipes when the world ended. Maybe it's something else, something the virus did to adapt to the dark. It stops when the light hits it, its head tilting in a jerky, bird-like motion. It's tasting the air. I can see its nostrils flaring, the wet black tissue twitching. I raise the wrench, my knuckles white. My pistol is still tucked into my waistband, but in this narrow space, the muzzle flash would blind me and the noise would burst my eardrums. The thing lets out a low, vibrating hiss that I feel in my teeth. It moves with a terrifying, fluid grace, scuttling along the wall like a centipede. I don't wait for it to strike. I lunge forward, the wrench swinging in a short, brutal arc. It hits the thing in the shoulder, a dull thud that should have shattered bone, but the creature just absorbs the blow, its body yielding like soft clay. It lashes out with a clawed hand, raking my forearm. I feel the burn of the tears, the heat of my own blood. I roar, a sound I didn't know I could make, a primal, animalistic scream, and swing again. This time I catch it in the side of the head. There is a crunch, and the thing is slammed against the pipe. It falls, twitching, and I don't stop. I rain blows down on it, the wrench rising and falling until my arms are numb, and the thing is a shapeless mass of gray and red. I lean back against the wall, gasping for air. The flashlight is rolling on the floor, its beam spinning around the trench. I pick it up and shine it on my arm. The 3 deep gouges are weeping bright red blood. It looks so clean against the filth of the trench. I know what this means. I know the rules of this new world. 1 scratch, 1 bite, that's all it takes. I look at the blood, and for the first time since the sirens, I feel a strange sense of peace. The struggle is almost over. The failsafe is finally, truly broken. But not yet. I have a few hours, maybe a day, before the fever starts, before the red eye becomes my own. I grab my first aid kit and pour raw alcohol over the wounds. The pain is a white-hot brand, a scream of nerves that tells me I'm still human. I wrap the arm tightly in gauze, the white fabric turning red instantly. I have work to do. If I'm going to go out, I'm going to make sure the door is locked from the inside. I crawl back toward the hatch, every movement a struggle against the rising tide of exhaustion and the creeping fire in my arm. I reach the silo floor and look up. The scratching is louder now, a frantic, rhythmic thrumming. They are at the hatch. They are right above me. I move to the secondary cooling manifold, a series of heavy valves that control the liquid nitrogen used to keep the missile's guidance systems at stable temperatures. It's a closed-loop system, but there's an emergency vent. I grab the valve handle. It's cold, even through my gloves. I think about the dog. I think about the lasagna. I think about the world that was, and the world that is, and the world that will never be. I turn the valve. The hiss of the escaping nitrogen is a roar, a freezing cloud of white vapor that fills the bottom of the silo in seconds. The temperature plummets. I can feel the moisture on my skin turn to ice. Above me, the scratching slows. The infected are warm-blooded, or at least they rely on the heat of their stolen metabolism. The cold is their enemy. I see the hatch above me start to frost over, the metal turning white. The sounds from above turn from scratching to dull, muffled thumps as the things freeze in place, their limbs turning to brittle glass. I sit down at the base of the missile, the nitrogen fog swirling around me like a shroud. My arm is numb now, the pain replaced by a dull, throbbing cold. I look at the pistol in my hand. One mag left. I think about the eye in the crack. I wonder if it's still there, frozen in the red light, waiting for a spring that will never come. The silo is silent now. The machine is still. I am the last failsafe, and I have done my job. I have held the line. I have locked the tomb. I lean my head back against the cold steel of the Minuteman I, and close my eyes. The dark is no longer something to be feared. It's just the long sleep of the earth. I pull the trigger one last time, but the sound is lost in the white, freezing mist, a tiny snap in the vast, cold silence of the end of the world. The click of the firing pin hitting a frozen primer is a sound I will carry into whatever hell awaits me. It wasn't a bang. It wasn't the release I'd prayed for. It was a pathetic metallic snap, muffled by the layer of rime ice already coating the Beretta's slide. The nitrogen had done more than just silence the screamers above. It had reached into the very mechanics of my salvation and seized them shut. I stared at the barrel, a hollow black eye mocking me in the red emergency strobe of the silo. I pulled the trigger again. Click, again, click. The universe wasn't done with me. It wanted me to watch. It wanted me to be the witness to its cold, silent funeral. I let the pistol drop. It didn't even clatter. It thudded into the deepening drift of nitrogen snow that was accumulating at the base of the Minuteman I. My breath was a thick, crystallized plume, and every lungful felt like swallowing a handful of razor blades. I leaned my head back against the missile's fuselage, the heat-shielding tiles sucking the last of the warmth from my scalp. I was becoming part of the machine. I was becoming part of the tomb. Then the console hummed. It shouldn't have been able to. The nitrogen purge was designed to be a terminal event for the electronics not shielded by the primary vacuum seals, but a low, rhythmic throb began to vibrate through the floor plating, traveling up my spine. It wasn't the sound of the dead. It was the sound of a sequence. On the primary monitor, shielded behind 3 inches of reinforced plexiglass, a single line of amber text flickered through the frost. Remote command override STRATCOM lead. My heart, sluggish and heavy, gave a painful lurch. STRATCOM was gone. Offutt Air Force Base had been a dark spot on the map for 6 days. The Looking Glass aircraft, the Doomsday planes, were supposed to be the only thing left of the chain of command, but even they had fallen silent after the first 48 hours of the Great Dying. Operator 47, do you copy? The voice came through the emergency induction speaker, crackling with a distortion that made it sound like it was being filtered through a throat full of gravel. It wasn't the smooth, practiced tone of a controller. It was frantic. It was desperate. It was Colonel Miller. I knew that voice. He was the man who had signed my certification 3 years ago. The man who had told us that we were the guardians of the peace, the silent sentinels. I reached for the comms unit, my fingers cracking as I forced them to move. My glove was frozen to the console, and I had to rip it away, leaving a layer of Nomex behind. This is 47, I wheezed, my voice a dry rattle. Silo is compromised. Nitrogen purge active. I am in no condition to assist. Listen to me, 4-7, Miller's voice broke, a sob catching in the static. The Denver sanctuary, it's breached, not from the outside, it started inside. The infection mutated, it's faster now. We're looking at a total loss of the continental interior. We have a directive, case Zulu Sierra. We are sanitizing the grid. The air left my lungs and it had nothing to do with the nitrogen. Sanitizing, I whispered. Colonel, there are 4 million people in that evacuation zone. My family. They were sent to the Cheyenne Mountain sublevels. You told us they'd be safe. There was a long silence, filled only with the hiss of the dying world and the roar of the freezing fog. When Miller spoke again, the desperation was gone, replaced by a cold, bureaucratic finality that was more terrifying than any zombie's moan. The Cheyenne complex was the first to go, son. We've lost the mountain, the things inside. They aren't just wandering, they're organized. They're using the communications arrays. They're trying to broadcast something, a signal, a frequency, I don't know. But the orders come from the remaining Joint Chiefs aboard the Night Watch. We are purging the hotspots. Your bird is targeted for Sector 7. Cheyenne. You need to clear the manual interlock. The frost has jammed the remote servos. I need you to climb the gantry, 4-7. I need you to pull the manual release for the Stage 1 igniter. I looked up. The gantry rose into the darkness. A skeleton of steel covered in a thick white fur of ice. Above it, the hatch, the one I had just frozen shut, the one holding back 100 or more of those things, was the only way to the interlock. He wanted me to climb into the mouth of the beast to incinerate what was left of my life, to kill my wife again, to kill everyone who might still be hiding in the dark of that mountain. I won't do it, I said, my voice gaining a sudden sharp clarity. The nitrogen, it's over 300 degrees below zero. They're dead up there, Miller. I killed them. I locked the tomb. They aren't dead, Miller screamed, his voice peaking into a shrill, distorted shriek. They don't die, the nitrogen just slows the cellular decay. As soon as that missile ignites, the heat will thaw them out. They'll be on you before the bird even clears the rim, but you have to do it. If that signal from Cheyenne reaches the other silos, they can override the PAL codes. They'll have the whole arsenal. They aren't just eating us anymore, they're replacing us. Do your duty, operator. Burn them. Burn it all. The screen flickered, showing a grainy thermal feed from a satellite high above. The Cheyenne Mountain entrance wasn't a scene of carnage, it was a hive. Thousands of heat signatures, faint, pulsing blips, were swarming around the transmission towers. They weren't fighting, they were working. My stomach turned. The betrayal wasn't just Miller, it was the world. The rules had changed while I was buried in my hole. I looked at the eye in the crack again. Through the thickening frost, I saw it move. It wasn't a frantic twitch. It was a slow, deliberate blink. The creature's eyelid cracked the ice as it opened. It was watching me. It wasn't waiting for spring. It was waiting for me to move. It was waiting for the heat. I stood up, my legs feeling like pillars of salt. The pain in my arm had moved to my chest, a crushing weight of betrayal and realization. Miller wasn't trying to save humanity. He was trying to cover the tracks of a species that had already lost. He wanted me to be the executioner of a ghost world. I'm not climbing that gantry, Colonel, I said. If you don't, I will trigger the self-destruct, Miller hissed. I'll turn that silo into a radioactive crater. You'll die anyway. At least this way you die a hero. You die for the mission. The mission died when you sent my family to a graveyard, I replied. I reached for the manual override lever at the base of the console, not the one for the igniter, but the one for the ventilation baffles. If I opened them, the nitrogen would vent, but the heat from the surface would rush in. The eye would thaw. The things above would wake up, but the missile would stay in its hole. What are you doing? 4-7, back away from the console. Miller's voice was fatting, the signal being jammed by something, not the weather but a rhythmic, pulsing interference. A signal, the one from Cheyenne. I gripped the lever. My skin tore away, sticking to the frozen metal, but I didn't feel it. I felt only a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't a failsafe anymore. I was a saboteur. I'm ending the cycle, Miller. You want to sanitize the world. Do it yourself. I'm staying here with the truth. I pulled the lever. The sound was like a choir of banshees. The baffles groaned and shrieked as they forced themselves open against the ice. A rush of warm, stagnant air from the upper levels plummeted down into the silo, colliding with the nitrogen fog in a violent, roiling turbulence. The white mist turned into a gray, wet slush. Above me, I heard it. The scratching. It started as a single wet thud, then another. The brittle glass of their limbs was softening. The ice was melting. The things above were waking up from their flash-frozen slumber, and they were hungry. The dull thumps turned into frantic, wet slapping sounds. They were sliding down the inner walls of the silo, dropping 40, 50 feet onto the gantry levels below. The red light flickered and died, replaced by the flickering orange of a localized electrical fire in the console. In the guttering light, I saw the first one. It hit the gantry 10 feet above me, its body snapping with a sound like dry kindling as it landed, but it didn't stop. It began to pull itself toward me, its jaw hanging by a single tendon, its eyes, those pale, milky orbs, fixed on my throat. 4-7, acknowledge the signal. It's everywhere. It's in the... Miller's voice was cut off by a burst of static that sounded like a scream of 1,000 voices layered over one another. It wasn't noise. It was data. The signal from Cheyenne. The creature on the gantry stopped. It didn't lunge. It tilted its head, its ears twitching. It was listening to the static. Then it looked at the missile. It didn't want me. It wanted the bird. My breath caught. They weren't just zombies. They were a collective, a biological processor, and they needed the delivery system I was guarding. The betrayal wasn't just from the military. It was a betrayal of nature itself. We had built the tools of our own extinction, and now the virus was reaching for the trigger. I looked at the Minuteman III, the peacekeeper. I looked at the creature crawling toward the launch interface. Its fingers, black with frostbite and rot, were reaching for the keypad. It knew. It knew the codes. It was tapping into the collective memory of every operator it had consumed. I didn't have a gun that worked. I didn't have a way out. My arm was a useless, frozen weight at my side. I looked at the base of the missile, at the fuel lines I had exposed when I opened the baffles. The RP-1 fuel was stable, but the liquid oxygen was venting, creating a shimmering halo around the base of the rocket. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the one thing I had left, a Zippo lighter, my father's. It had been in my family for 3 generations. In case the power goes out, he'd said when he gave it to me. The creature above me hissed, a sound of pure, calculated malice. It had bypassed the first security lock. The silo's internal speakers began to chime, the 10-minute countdown to a launch I couldn't stop, not from the console. "Hey," I yelled, my voice echoing in the vast, hollow chamber. The thing turned. It looked at me with a terrifying, cold intelligence. "You want the fire," I whispered, my thumb finding the flint wheel. "Here's the goddamn fire." I struck the lighter. The flame was tiny, a flickering orange spark in the encroaching dark. I held it over the venting oxygen line. The creature's eyes widened. It lunged, a blur of gray flesh and broken bone, but it was too late. The world didn't end with a whimper. It didn't end with a cold sleep in the dark. It ended with a roar that swallowed the silence, a white-hot bloom of justice that turned the silo into a chimney of sunfire. As the fuel ignited, I didn't feel the pain. I didn't feel the cold. For one beautiful, terrible second, I was the brightest thing in the world. I was the fail-safe. I was the end of the line. And as the mountain above me buckled and the earth itself groaned under the weight of the explosion, I knew I had finally done my job. I had kept the keys. I had locked the door. And I had taken the monsters with me into the bright, cleansing heat of the end. The last thing I saw wasn't the eye in the crack. It was the face of my wife, smiling in the sun of a world that used to be. And then there was only the light, total, blinding, and perfect. The silo was gone. The mission was over. The silence was finally, mercifully complete. I was no longer an operator. I was just dust, dancing in the updraft of a dying world, free from the cold, free from the dark, and finally at peace. The signal from Cheyenne hit a wall of fire and died. The looking-glass aircraft circled a crater that hadn't been there a moment ago, their sensors screaming of a loss they couldn't comprehend. In the heart of the wasteland, one light had gone out so that a darker one couldn't ignite. I had held the line, even when the line was drawn in my own blood and ashes. The world would go on or it wouldn't, but it wouldn't be because I gave them the fire. I took it with me. I took it all with me. And in the vast, cold silence of the end, that was enough. It had to be enough. The white was not a color, but a consumption. It was the sound of 1,000 suns being born in a space no larger than a coffin, a roar that was so loud it became a silence that pressed against the very fabric of my soul. I remember the sensation of the floor vanishing, not falling away, but simply ceasing to exist as a solid thing. The reinforced concrete, the miles of copper wiring, the lead-lined consoles that had been my only companions for the longest months of my life, they all turned to a fine, incandescent mist, and I was with them. I was the mist. I was the heat. I was the sudden, violent expansion of a heart that had been kept in cold storage for too long. People think of a nuclear event as a scream, but from the center, it is a sigh. It is the ultimate release of tension. The two-man rule, the authentication codes, the crushing weight of the keys hanging around my neck, all of it evaporated in a microsecond, stripped away like dead skin to reveal something bright and terrifyingly pure underneath. I felt the molecules of my body stretching, reaching out to touch the edges of the silo, vibrating at a frequency that turned my bones to glass and then to light. There was no pain, only a profound sense of displacement, as if I had been a cramped, folded map my entire life, and someone had finally, mercifully, smoothed me out across the horizon. High above, in the thin, freezing air of the stratosphere, the looking-glass aircraft must have rocked in the thermal punch of my departure. I could almost see them, the pilots with their eyes shielded, the technicians staring at screens that had gone from green-tinted tactical data to a blinding, electronic scream. They would be searching for the trajectory, looking for the arc of a Minuteman III streaking toward a city already half devoured by the dead. They would be waiting for the start of the final war, the one we had practiced for in the dark while the world above turned into a slaughterhouse. But there was no missile. There was only the crater. I had turned the silo into a tomb and a forge, smelting the end of the world into a localized spark. I had denied them their fire. The generals in their mountain fastnesses, the shadows of a government clinging to the old ways of destruction, while the living dead pounded on their blast doors. I had cut their reach. I had taken the keys to the kingdom and melted them down in the palm of my hand. The darker light they wanted to ignite, that global chain reaction of spite and scorched earth, had died with me in the dirt of the Great Plains. I felt myself rising now, not as a man but as the updraft itself. I was the fallout, a ghost of ash and ionized air drifting over the shattered landscape. I saw the world as I climbed, a panoramic view of a tragedy I had only seen through periscopes and low-res monitors. The cities were dark, sprawling ribcages of steel and rot, glowing with the sickly orange of untended fires. The highways were frozen veins, clogged with the rusted husks of the exodus that never arrived. And the zombies, the things that had once been my neighbors, my friends, the clerks at the grocery store, they were everywhere. From this height they looked like a slow-moving tide of charcoal, a restless, aimless sea of hunger. But in the immediate radius of my silo there was a circle of absolute stillness. For miles the heat had scrubbed the earth clean. The horde that had been pressing against my hatch, the ones whose fingers had scraped like dry leaves against the steel, were gone. They weren't just dead, they were unmade. Their hunger had been answered by a greater hunger, a physical law that didn't care about their viral resilience or their mindless persistence. In that circle, there was peace. The grass would not grow for a long time and the soil would hum with a dangerous energy, but for now it was quiet. The scratching had stopped. I drifted on the wind, a conscious shimmer in the radioactive plume. I saw the Missouri River winding like a black snake through the gray plains, and I felt a strange, detached sorrow for the beauty that was still there, hidden under the layer of decay. I thought of the millions of tons of wheat that would never be harvested, the silos full of grain that would rot while the world starved. I thought of the libraries, the museums, the music halls, all the delicate, intricate things we had built, now being slowly reclaimed by the damp and the dark. We had spent so much time worrying about the bomb, about the flash that would end it all, that we never imagined the end would be so quiet, so slow, and so hungry. We expected a bang, and we got a whimper that lasted for years. My bang was a protest. It was a refusal to let the old world's madness crown the new world's misery. The image of my wife stayed with me, a steady anchor in the dissolving sea of my consciousness. She was standing in that backyard in Omaha, the one with the fence I never quite finished painting. The sun was catching the gold in her hair, and she was laughing at something the dog had done. That memory was more real to me now than the cold steel of the launch console. It was the sun of a world that used to be, and I realized that I hadn't just been protecting the silos or the codes, I had been protecting that light. If I had turned the key, if I had let the missiles fly, I would have been erasing her. I would have been making the entire universe as cold and dark as the bottom of a missile tube. By choosing to stay, by choosing to burn right where I stood, I had kept that memory sacred. It was a small victory, a microscopic flicker in the vast, encroaching night, but it was mine. I had died a human being, not a cog in a doomsday machine. I had died for a woman who was already gone, for a world that was already broken, but I had died with my soul intact. I watched the looking glass plane bank away, its mission profile shattered, its purpose evaporated. Without the silo's cooperation, without the data link, they were just men in a high-altitude metal tube, watching the world burn from a safe distance. I felt a flicker of pity for them. They still had to live in the world I was leaving. They still had to find a place to land where the ground wasn't moving with the weight of the undead. They still had to carry the burden of what they had been prepared to do. I was free. I was the dust dancing in the red light of a setting sun, weightless and unburdened. The radiation that would have been my death sentence if I had survived the blast was now just a part of my new, shimmering skin. I was the atmosphere. I was the rain that would eventually fall over the parched, blood-soaked earth. As I drifted higher, the curvature of the earth became visible, a blue and white marble stained with the brown smudges of smoke and ruin. Even from here, the world looked fragile. It looked like something that could still be saved, or at least something that deserved to rest. The fires of the apocalypse were many, but the fire I had unleashed was different. It was a cleansing thing, a cauterization of a wound that had been festering since the first sirens wailed. I thought about the other operators in other silos, hidden away in the Dakotas, in Russia, in the depths of the ocean. Were they still waiting? Were they still clutching their keys, listening to the static of a dead command structure, wondering if they were the last men on Earth? I hoped they would see my light. I hoped they would see the signal of my silence and understand. We weren't the guardians of the future anymore. We were the custodians of a past that needed to be let go. The silence I had sought for so long was finally expanding to fill the universe. The static in my mind, the constant, low-level hum of anxiety that comes from knowing you are holding the leash of a monster, was gone. There was only the vast, cool dark of the upper atmosphere and the slow, rhythmic turning of the planet. I felt the last of my identity beginning to fray at the edges, the I of the operator dissolving into the we of the elements. I wasn't the man who turned the key anymore. I was the wind that sighed through the empty skyscrapers of Chicago. I was the frost that would form on the abandoned tanks in the streets of New York. I was a part of the silence. It was enough. In the end, we all want to know that our lives meant something, that our choices mattered. I had been given the power to end the world, and I had used it to end myself instead. I had spared the remnants of humanity the final, radioactive indignity of a nuclear winter on top of a biological collapse. I had given them a chance, however slim, to find a way to live in the ruins without the sky falling on their heads. It wasn't a hero's end. There would be no medals, no monuments, no history books to record my sacrifice. The world would never know the name of the man who stayed in the dark so they could have the dim, gray light of their new reality. But I knew, and she knew, the woman in the sun, waiting for me at the end of the long, bright tunnel. The light was fading now, the intense heat of the explosion cooling as I dispersed into the global currents. The total, blinding, and perfect clarity was softening into a gentle, eternal twilight. I looked down one last time at the crater, my crater, and saw it not as a scar, but as a period at the end of a very long, very dark sentence. The mission was over. The line had been held. I felt a final, ghostly warmth as the memory of her smile merged with the fading glow of the atoms that used to be my heart. There was no more operator. There was no more silo. There was only the peace of the dust, the freedom of the updraft, and the long, quiet sleep of a world that had finally stopped screaming. I closed the eyes I no longer had, and for the first time in an eternity, I wasn't afraid of the dark. The fire was gone, and I had taken it all with me. The world was left to the living and the dead, but it was left in peace from the fires of the old gods. That was the only victory I could offer, and in the vast, cold silence of the end, it was more than enough. It was everything. I drifted further, caught in a jet stream that pulled me toward the east, toward the rising sun that would soon illuminate the wreckage of the Atlantic coast. I would be there to see it. I would be the haze in the air and the salt in the spray. I would be the quiet witness to whatever came next. Perhaps in 1,000 years, the radiation would fade, the virus would burn itself out, and something new would crawl out of the caves and the bunkers. Perhaps they would find the glass-lined pits we left behind and wonder what kind of giants lived there, and why we chose to burn. They wouldn't understand the keys or the codes, but maybe they would understand the silence. Maybe they would see the beauty in the fact that we chose to stop. The last flicker of my conscious thought was a sensation of falling, not into a pit, but into a bed. It was the feeling of a heavy blanket being pulled up to my chin after a long, exhausting shift. The cold of the silo was a million miles away. The heat of the blast was a fatting dream. There was only the soft, rhythmic pulse of the earth beneath me and the infinite stars above. I was just a part of the story now, a footnote written in ash and light, drifting toward a horizon that had no more sirens, no more keys, and no more hunger. I was finally truly home. The world turned beneath me, indifferent and ancient, and I let go of the last thread of my name. The operator was gone. The dust was dancing. The silence was complete. And in that silence, I finally found the sleep I had been denied for so long. The end was not a wall, it was an opening. And as I passed through it, I realized that even in the middle of an apocalypse, even at the very end of everything, there is a kind of grace that can only be found when you finally stop fighting the inevitable and start embracing the eternal. The fire was out. The watch was over. I was free.